This video is going to demonstrate some of the basic image plotting and investigational tools in Solo+MIA and MIA Toolbox. To show this off, I'm going to use one of our standard demo data sets, and if you're looking at the workspace browser in either of those products, you can find the model cache on the bottom right and a demo data folder there. And the one I'm going to use is all the way at the bottom. It's the wire alloy image. And I'm simply going to double click that to load it into our base workspace. Now, once you've loaded in your data, simply right click on it and say plot to bring up a standard simple plot of the data. By default, that plot consists of two things: the plot controls and also the target figure that shows you the individual data being plotted. The plot controls start off in data summary mode, where you choose for your x-axis whether you want your variables, in this case the energy levels, or samples, in which case it would be the pixels. And so, for instance, here is the mean image, and you can see that this data actually consists of a series of wires, different alloys of wires embedded in a matrix. And this is the mean image of all of those. If I switch back to the variables dimension, you can see the average spectrum. Now, in the plot controls, under the plot menu, if we go to the pixels selection, then our x-axis is still the variables, but now we can choose individual pixels to show. And here you can see that, in fact, the individual pixels are very low signal. These are counts over here on the side. So it's very high noise data. And I can select, using, for instance, control and clicking, I can select multiple different items from there to overlay. The other thing to note is that because there are so many pixels, we actually have two sliders. The first slides down to about 500 items, but then there's an additional page. The second slider next to that allows us to index the entire image. So if I pull that slider all the way down, I can get all the way down to the 16,000 pixels that are within this image. And so by that means you can access any of them. Obviously, this is a fairly complicated image, and there's so much data in there. This isn't a very practical way to navigate through it. We'll look at another way in a moment. But first I want to switch from the plot mode pixels to plot mode slabs. And now we are looking at images from each of the energy levels. So for instance, if I come down in energy level here to around 0.27 kiloelectron volts, I can see that there's a background and the wires are not showing signal at that point. Here again we have two separate sliders because there are a fair number of variables in this data. We need two sliders to be able to access all of them. Again, the left slider accesses within the right slider's window. So practically speaking, this is not a very useful way to navigate the data unless you know that there's a particular variable or particular pixel that you want to go to. So an alternative way of investigating the data is to use the trend tool. And there's several ways to get at the trend tool. One of them is, if you're viewing a plot of the data, simply go to File, in Plot Controls, Open In, and here we have several options. We could take this data and push it into the analysis window, which we'll talk about in a separate video, or open in Trend Tool, open in Image Manager, or open in Particle Analysis. This video is going to describe Trend Tool, so I'm going to click that. And while it opens, I'm going to rearrange the two windows it gave so you'll be able to see them in the video. On the left-hand side, you have, as I close up my windows here so you can see everything better, on the left-hand side you can see, again, the average spectrum, just like we saw before. Now, when it first came up, you may have noticed that there were controls on the bottom of this window. I'll bring them up automatically again. These are the sensitivity controls for the automatic peak finding. And I could adjust these, and if I chose set, it would choose those peaks. But I'm going to tell cancel first of all, so you can see how this works manually. Given the spectrum, if I click on the first push pin in this toolbar, the lower toolbar, it will give me a marker. Now that marker is active in that if I drag it around, it will show me the image from the given location in the data. So as I drag this, for instance, over to this peak here, you can see that the image at that peak includes those 2 rows of wires. Now all this is doing is extracting the given variable, the image at the given variable, just like we were doing before, but in a much more interactive way. And as I drag this around, I can view the signal from various different peaks in the data and very quickly get an overview of how heterogeneous the data is. In the trend view on the right, there's lots of different options here, one of which is the ability to select individual pixels, so that if I click on that and then draw a box around several pixels in the image, it shows me the individual spectra from the pixels I just selected, just as if we had gone the other direction back in plot controls. Now, in fact, behind this, there is plot controls, which I'm going to return back to data summary, so we're viewing the average again. Other things you can do in TrendTool include adding additional markers by clicking the push pin again. And then, with each additional marker, and in fact, right-clicking on the white space and saying Add Marker is another way to add markers. With each additional marker, a new color is assigned in the trend view. Now, like a previous video where we talked about auto-scaling, in the trend view there's a toolbar button with an up and down arrow. If I click on that, it auto-contrasts the image, so that now we get rid of pixels that are on the high end and low end of the image. And very quickly you can see the red, green, blue slabs here that have been assigned are showing the individual markers from the left. And so very quickly I can investigate what the heterogeneity is of that. If you want to capture a particular image, the second toolbar button, which says Spawn, will open up a new data set that contains just the individual responses that I captured. Now, going back to my trend data view, one of the other things you can do with markers is if you right-click any individual marker, there's a number of changes you can make. By default, any marker comes in at being height, which basically says it's taking the value at that given variable. But you can also make that, for instance, an area, in which case the marker splits into 2, and now it's doing an integration between those 2. You can also delete markers, which I'm going to do on the yellow and the red marker. So now we're viewing just the integrated intensity between my 2 markers. And if I drag that open, you can see that, for instance, integrating across all 4 of those peaks gives me a very even view of almost all of my wires over here. Additionally, you can do things like finding the position of a peak between the 2 markers, or the half-width full maximum of a peak within the markers. For some image data, those methods don't work as well because they do require interpolation, and so they may take a while, but they are possibilities and are very useful for certain kinds of data.